My family laughed when I mentioned my plus one. My aunt sneered that imaginary men did not count, but their arrogant smiles vanished, and wine glasses shattered across the hardwood. The moment three black, bulletproof SUVs blocked our driveway. The man stepping out was America's most ruthless tech billionaire, carrying a folder thick enough to send her precious nephew to federal prison. This is not a Cinderella story. It is a carefully orchestrated hunt, and they are the prey. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. We truly appreciate your continued support, but unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without the funds needed to operate. If you enjoy our stories and want to help our team cover their living expenses so they can keep creating for you, please consider donating just $1. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment below. My name is Molly Morrison, and I am 34 years old. The air inside the rented Lake Tahoe villa was thick, not just with the scent of expensive catered truffle risotto and vintage wines, but with a suffocating, unbearable hypocrisy. Our family had pooled their resources to secure this sprawling, multi-million-dollar lakeside estate for our annual reunion. It was a tradition that served absolutely no purpose other than acting as a ruthless, unspoken competition of wealth and social status. I sat completely huddled in the far corner of the sweeping cedar balcony, pulling my faded, oversized gray-knitted sweater tighter around my shoulders to block out the chill of the evening air. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors, I watched my relatives mingle and parade around the living room. They were practically dripping in designer labels, flashing heavy gold watches, and clinking crystal champagne flutes together. I looked exactly like someone who had wandered in off the street to ask for a warm meal, which was precisely how they wanted me to look. My perceived failure was the foundation upon which they built their own fragile superiority. The center of the grand living room belonged entirely to two people, basking in a sickening glow of familial worship. First was my younger sister, Chloe, at 26 years old. She was a burgeoning real estate influencer who spent far more time adjusting the artificial ring light attached to her phone than she ever spent actually speaking to a human being. A dense cluster of aunts and uncles hung on to her every empty word as she loudly boasted about her latest property tour video hitting over 2 million views. Beside her stood my cousin Derek. Derek was the undeniable golden boy of the family lineage. He wore a ridiculously tight silk shirt, unbuttoned just enough to aggressively show off a newly acquired, painfully gaudy gold chain. He was currently holding court with the older generation of men, loudly and aggressively bragging about his recent cryptocurrency investments. He claimed, with a smug grin, that he had pulled in pure profits of over 300% in just 4 short months. They looked at him with wide, greedy eyes, as if he were the second coming of Wall Street royalty. I looked at him from my dark corner and saw something entirely different, but I kept my mouth firmly shut. In this family ecosystem, if you were not actively flaunting wealth or internet fame, you were automatically demoted to the status of the help. My own mother walked past the balcony, stopping only to gesture vaguely and dismissively toward the empty silver ice bucket resting on the wet bar. "Molly, be a dear and run down to the corner store at the bottom of the hill to get more ice," she instructed, not even bothering to make eye contact with me. "Derek needs his expensive whiskey chilled properly, and you are not doing anything anyway." I stayed firmly seated on the wooden bench. I took a very slow, measured breath, letting the freezing mountain air fill my lungs, and then let it out. "No, I cannot go right now," I said, ensuring my voice remained completely steady and clear. "I am waiting for my boyfriend to arrive. I need to be right here so I can let him in at the main security gate." The entire living room went absolutely dead silent. The rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses stopped in midair. Conversations died instantly on their tongues. For a duration of about 5 seconds, you could hear a pin drop on the hardwood floor. Then, the laughter began. It started as a low, mocking chuckle deep in Derek's throat, and rapidly erupted into a deafening chorus of howling, condescending laughter from every single corner of the vast room. It was vicious. It was the exact kind of laughter usually reserved for a pathetic, delusional child making up a fantastical lie. Aunt Brenda, who was Derek's mother, stepped forward from the jeering crowd, the floorboards creaking slightly beneath her designer heels. She took a slow, theatrical sip of her expensive dark wine, her manicured fingers deliberately stroking the heavy, shimmering diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She looked down at me through the glass door with a potent mixture of fake pity and absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Come on, Molly," Aunt Brenda sneered, her voice carrying effortlessly over the dying chuckles of the room. "You do not need to lie just to get our attention. Imaginary men do not count." That was exactly the invitation Derek needed to escalate the cruelty. He sauntered aggressively over to the open balcony doors, pulling out his latest model smartphone and pointing the camera lens directly at my face. I could clearly see the red recording light blinking in the dim evening shadows. "Tell us all about him, Molly," Derek mocked, his voice dripping with a thick, poisonous layer of fake sympathy. "Is he an artificial intelligence chatbot you coded in your little dark bedroom? Or maybe he is one of those unemployed crypto scammers from overseas who promised to marry you if you just sent him $500 in digital gift cards." Chloe giggled loudly in the background, immediately holding up her own phone to catch my reaction from a different angle. They were deliberately and methodically cornering me. They were orchestrating this public humiliation to post on their private family group chat, or perhaps to broadcast out to Chloe's millions of followers as a pathetic, viral joke. They expected exactly what had always happened in the past. They fully expected the old Molly, the weak Molly who would blush a deep crimson, stammer out a broken excuse, put her head down in ultimate shame, and run away to the nearest bathroom to cry her eyes out until the party concluded. But I did not cry. I did not shrink back into my faded gray sweater, and I did not look away. Instead, I sat perfectly still, maintaining an unbroken, unblinking, and entirely deadpan eye contact directly with Derek's camera lens. I felt an eerie, absolute calm wash over every nerve in my body. I slowly lifted my left wrist and looked down at the face of my watch. The seconds were steadily ticking away. 3 minutes, maybe less. My heavy silence was not an act of submission or fear. It was a precise, calculated countdown. I decided to let them laugh. I decided to let them record every single second of this unbridled, toxic arrogance. Because the higher they built this fragile pedestal of lies, the harder the concrete was going to feel when my reality violently crashed into their pathetic fantasy. My family loved to imagine me as a miserable, low-level data entry clerk who barely scraped by on a meager salary. They had constructed an entire pathetic narrative around my faded sweaters, my lack of designer handbags, and my quiet demeanor at family gatherings. The truth, however, lived exactly 18 months in the past, buried deep behind the reinforced steel doors and biometric retinal scanners of Aegis Core Data Solutions. I was never a struggling nobody. I was a senior cyber network analyst, a highly specialized white-hat hacker dedicated to dismantling complex international economic cybercrimes. I lived in the digital shadows entirely by choice. I preferred the flawless, unforgiving logic of machine code to the exhausting, transparent pretense of high society. My life was quiet, highly structured, and completely hidden from the arrogant, judgmental eyes of my relatives. That carefully curated sanctuary of glowing monitors and humming cooling fans was permanently disrupted the morning Julian Vance walked onto our heavily guarded investigative floor. Julian was a self-made billionaire and the founding architect of a global cybersecurity empire. In the financial district, his name was synonymous with absolute, cold-blooded ruthlessness. He was a man who destroyed rival corporations before breakfast and never left loose ends. He did not come to our private agency for a casual corporate consultation. He bypassed our nervous executives, ignoring their outstretched hands, and demanded direct access to the raw data floor. A highly sophisticated, Phantom Syndicate had managed to siphon a massive, seemingly untraceable flow of capital directly from his primary investment fund. He walked through our aisles radiating a cold, terrifying fury, systematically dismissing every senior analyst and department head my boss threw at the problem. Eventually, the heavily encrypted drive was slammed onto my desk. Julian stood over me, looking down at a woman wearing an oversized hoodie and nursing a cup of stale coffee. The skepticism on his chiseled face was palpable. He fully expected another useless consultant who would waste his time with empty technical jargon. I completely ignored his intimidating physical presence, plugged his drive into my isolated terminal, and opened a blank command line. It took me exactly 48 hours to break it, while his entire elite internal security division had spent 3 weeks chasing ghost servers across foreign continents. I sat in total silence and isolated the fractional algorithm the thieves were using to micro-route the stolen money through a labyrinth of fake charitable trusts. When I slid the decrypted routing matrix across the desk to him, the heavy skepticism in his dark eyes instantly shattered. It was replaced by a sharp, piercing shock, and then a deep, undeniable fascination. In that silent exchange, he did not just see a highly capable employee who had done her job, he saw an intellectual equal. That was how our secret began. It was a gritty, unconventional romance that existed entirely off the grid. It was never built on extravagant bouquets of red roses, flashy diamond gifts, or highly publicized candlelight dinners at exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants. Our profound connection was forged in the freezing ambient temperatures of subterranean server rooms, illuminated only by the harsh blue glare of scrolling data streams. Our dates consisted of late-night tactical discussions over lukewarm takeout boxes, or quiet, hours-long flights across the country on his private jet, while the rest of the world slept beneath us. We found a rare, unspoken solace in our shared isolation. We were both individuals who spent our entire lives looking straight through the deceptive facades of human nature, analyzing the raw, ugly, unvarnished data underneath. In his cold, highly calculated world of corporate warfare, my intellect and blunt honesty were the only things that offered him genuine warmth. In my quiet, secluded existence, his unwavering respect and fierce protection became the anchor I never knew I needed. However, Julian was a man constantly surrounded by predators. At that specific time, he was ruthlessly orchestrating a hostile takeover of a massive rival tech conglomerate. The financial sector was an active war zone, and his corporate enemies were desperately searching for any single vulnerability to exploit, smear, or destroy him. If the world discovered who I was to him, I would immediately become a target. I would be the most glaring vulnerability he possessed. To ensure my absolute safety from the vicious, unforgiving media cycles and the dangerous corporate espionage of his cutthroat world, we made a clinical, necessary decision together. We drafted and signed an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Our entire relationship was meticulously wiped from the physical and digital grid. There were no photographs, no digital trails, and no public acknowledgments of our existence as a couple. I willingly and happily remained the invisible ghost in his chaotic life. And he became the beautiful secret I fiercely guarded. My relatives laughed at me because they thought I was completely alone in the world, entirely unaware that the most powerful, dangerous man in the country was the very one who held my hand in the dark. The illusion of my cousin's self-made wealth was not just a minor exaggeration. It was a catastrophic, towering house of cards built on pure theft. I discovered the absolute rot beneath his shiny exterior purely by accident. Several months ago, during a routine, wide-net data sweep for Aegis Core, I was tracking the digital footprints of a massive, international financial Ponzi scheme. As I parsed through hundreds of thousands of encrypted transaction logs, hunting for the primary money laundering nodes, a specific internet protocol address flashed across my monitor. I froze in my seat. The geographic coordinates and the service provider details did not point to a shadowy offshore server farm. They pinged directly to a luxury townhouse in the suburbs. It was Derek's home address. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard as I bypassed his laughably weak personal firewalls. What I found inside his private digital ledgers made my blood run entirely cold. Derek was not a cryptocurrency genius. He was a desperate, drowning man. His legitimate accounts contained exactly $0 in actual profit. Worse than his own financial ruin was the horrific source of his initial capital. I traced a massive, illegal wire transfer and discovered a series of heavily forged property deeds. Derek had secretly mortgaged the entire ancestral estate left by our late grandparents. That sprawling, beautiful plot of land was the sole financial safety net for our entire extended family, meant to secure the retirement of my parents, my aunts, and my uncles. Derek had taken all of it, every single cent of their collective future, and dumped it into a collapsing digital black hole to fund his pathetic lifestyle and buy his gaudy gold chains. The sheer audacity of his crime made the family gatherings physically nauseating to endure. While he was actively stealing their futures, they were busy practically kissing his feet. Aunt Brenda was the absolute worst offender. At every single Sunday dinner, she would casually sip her expensive cocktails and loudly complain about my dead-end, low-paying tech support job. She would lean across the dinner table, her eyes gleaming with toxic greed, and actively manipulate my mother. "You really need to make Molly hand over whatever tiny little savings she has tucked away," Aunt Brenda would hiss, her voice dripping with fake concern. Derek could double or even triple her money in a matter of weeks. It is an absolute shame to let her measly tech paycheck sit rotting in a basic checking account when your nephew is a verified financial genius. My mother would just nod along, completely blind to the trap. They were not just satisfied with treating me like a miserable outcast. They actively wanted to serve me up on a silver platter, offering my hard-earned money to the very predator who was already orchestrating their total bankruptcy. They viewed me as nothing more than a naive sheep ready to be sheared. I brought the decrypted evidence to Julian later that same evening. We were sitting in the quiet, dim light of his private study. As he read through the financial logs and the forged mortgage documents, the ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Julian was a man who handled corporate warfare and billion-dollar hostile takeovers with a terrifying, stoic calm. But seeing the undeniable proof of how my own flesh and blood actively despised me and plotted to rob me completely shattered his iron composure. A dark, visceral anger flared in his eyes. He slammed the heavy leather portfolio shut, the sound echoing sharply off the mahogany walls. He was absolutely furious that the woman he respected and cherished above all others was being treated as disposable trash by a family of arrogant, oblivious fools. "Give me exactly 24 hours, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel that would have made any rival executive break into a cold sweat. "I will have my personal legal team freeze every single asset attached to his name. I will crush him into absolute dust by tomorrow morning. He will not even have the bus fare to make it to the courthouse." It was a tempting offer. The sheer power he wielded could have erased Derek from society with a single phone call. But I reached across the desk and gently placed my hand over his clenched fist. "No," I told him quietly, my voice entirely devoid of hesitation. "If you destroy him from the shadows, my family will spend the rest of their miserable lives painting him as a tragic victim of corporate greed. They will never believe the truth." I needed something far more potent than a quiet assassination of his character. I needed an airtight, undeniable fortress of legal evidence. I wanted to build a trap so perfectly constructed that when the jaws finally snapped shut, there would be absolutely no room for denial, no space for excuses, and no way for my family to look away from the monster they had created. I wanted to be the one holding the spotlight when their entire fake reality burned to the ground, freeing myself from their psychological manipulation once and for all. My trap was meticulously constructed, but Derek was a cornered rat, and cornered rats possess a very dangerous survival instinct. Just a week before the reunion, his rudimentary monitoring software flagged a series of aggressive decryption attempts targeting his primary encrypted wallet. He was nowhere near smart enough to trace the origin back to my specific terminal, but the digital footprint bounced off a proxy server tied directly to the public network grid of Aegis Core Data Solutions. He knew exactly where I worked. The realization that his quiet, supposedly pathetic cousin might be inside his financial walls sent him into a blind, desperate panic. He knew he could not stop the data leak. His only viable survival strategy was an immediate, ruthless character assassination. He needed to completely destroy my credibility before I ever had the chance to present my evidence. That was the true reason he hastily organized and heavily subsidized this extravagant weekend at Lake Tahoe. It was not a family vacation. It was a preemptive execution of my sanity. Over the past 5 days, Derek had been quietly pulling my relatives aside, whispering toxic lies into their willing ears. He manufactured a compelling narrative that I was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. He told Aunt Brenda that my demanding tech job had pushed me into a heavy addiction to prescription stimulants, leaving me drowning in secret debts. He warned them that my paranoia was peaking, and that I was planning to fabricate a massive, delusional conspiracy about his finances just to extort the family for drug money. While Derek was busy poisoning my family against me, the final alarm bells were ringing 3,000 miles away. Julian was standing in a glass-walled boardroom high above the Manhattan skyline, surrounded by aggressive corporate lawyers, about to finalize a merger worth several $billion. His burner phone vibrated aggressively against his ribs. It was a direct, encrypted emergency channel from his elite cyber defense division. Derek was not just running away. He was attempting to burn the entire house down with me locked inside. The security chief informed Julian that Derek had initiated a total liquidation protocol. He was attempting to desperately wire the last remaining fractions of our family's equity to an untraceable offshore account in the Caribbean. But the truly fatal mistake was Derek's clumsy attempt at framing. He was actively planting spoofed data logs designed to make it look like the massive theft was originating directly from my personal workstation at Aegis Core. He was trying to hand me a federal indictment for corporate cyber theft to cover his own escape. Julian did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. The rules of corporate engagement, the billions of dollars sitting on the mahogany table, the months of brutal negotiations all became instantly meaningless. He stood up abruptly, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked straight out of the boardroom without offering a single word of explanation to the stunned executives. As he strode down the marble hallway, he issued a rapid series of commands to his tactical security detail. He ordered his pilots to prep his private jet for immediate takeoff, and he commanded his most elite Vanguard team, stationed on the West Coast, to mobilize heavily armored vehicles and drive straight to the Lake Tahoe estate. Back in the suffocating reality of the rented villa, the trap Derek had set for me was springing completely shut. I stood on the balcony, completely surrounded by a tightening circle of hostile, judgmental faces. Aunt Brenda's cruel insult about my imaginary boyfriend still hung heavy in the freezing air, perfectly setting the stage for Derek's final strike. Derek took a step closer, keeping his phone camera locked firmly on my face, playing the role of the deeply concerned savior to absolute perfection. "We know you are sick, Molly," Derek said loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the back of the room. "We know about the debt. We know about the pills. You do not have to make up crazy stories about billionaires or imaginary boyfriends anymore. We are your family, and we just want to get you into a facility where you can get proper psychological help." The entire room nodded in solemn, sickening agreement. I looked past Derek's smug face and saw my own mother stepping forward. She was not looking at me with maternal love. She was looking at me like I was a rabid animal that needed to be put down for its own good. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held up a sleek white business card. "Derek found a wonderful private psychiatric clinic just outside the city. Sweetheart," my mother pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured pity. "He even offered to pay for your first 3 months of intensive inpatient treatment. Please, just put the ice bucket down and let us help you before you do something completely crazy and hurt yourself." The psychological violence was suffocating. They were actively gaslighting me, stripping away my reality, and preparing to lock me inside a mental institution just so the golden boy could finish robbing them blind. The tension in the room stretched until it was razor thin, vibrating with a deadly frequency. I was entirely isolated, backed against the freezing glass, staring down a room full of people who were ready to destroy my life based on the word of a thief. My countdown reached 0. My mother was still holding the glossy white psychiatric clinic business card in her trembling hand when a massive, deafening mechanical roar violently shattered the suffocating silence of the room. It was not the polite purr of a luxury sports car. It was the heavy, aggressive growl of high-horsepower engines pushing immense weight. Before anyone could even turn their heads toward the front windows, a horrific screech of twisting metal echoed through the freezing night air. 3 massive, blacked-out, heavily armored sport utility vehicles tore straight through the private wrought-iron security barricade at the edge of the property, sending twisted metal flying into the manicured landscaping. The heavy tires aggressively ground the expensive decorative gravel into dust as the convoy skidded to a perfectly synchronized halt directly in front of the sweeping glass entrance of the villa. The arrogant smirks instantly melted off the faces of every single relative in the room. The absolute silence that followed was entirely different from the one before. This was the breathless, primal silence of prey, realizing a predator had just entered the den. All 6 reinforced doors of the 3 vehicles opened simultaneously. More than a dozen towering men stepped out into the biting cold. They were not standard security guards. They moved with terrifying, practiced military precision, dressed in immaculate dark suits, with coiled acoustic earpieces trailing down their necks. In a matter of seconds, they fanned out, securing the perimeter, blocking the exits, and establishing an impenetrable wall of physical intimidation around the entire property. The family was entirely paralyzed, completely incapable of comprehending the tactical occupation unfolding on their rented driveway. Then, the heavy rear door of the center vehicle swung open. Julian Vance stepped out into the harsh glare of the halogen security lights. He had not bothered to change into one of his custom-tailored boardroom suits. He wore a heavy dark wool trench coat over a sleek black turtleneck. The collar turned up against the mountain wind. The casual attire somehow made him look infinitely more dangerous, like a king who did not need a crown to command absolute obedience. His dark, cold eyes swept through the massive glass walls of the villa, piercing through the brightly lit living room until they locked directly onto me standing in the corner of the balcony. He began to walk. The heavy oak front doors of the villa were pushed wide open by his vanguard, and Julian stepped over the threshold. As he moved through the grand living room, the collective realization of who he was hit the family like a physical blow. These were people who obsessed over wealth, who worshipped money and status. They knew exactly whose face regularly dominated the covers of global financial magazines. The murmurs started as a breathless ripple. Aunt Brenda let out a choked gasp, her manicured hand flying up to cover her mouth, her eyes bulging wide enough to show the whites all around her irises. The family instinctively scrambled backward, frantically parting like a terrified sea, desperately trying to get out of his direct path. Julian completely ignored them. He did not spare a single glance for the designer dresses, the gaudy gold chains, or the pathetic displays of supposed wealth. To a man who routinely bought and dismantled international conglomerates before lunch, the people in this room were completely insignificant. He walked straight through the paralyzing tension, his heavy footsteps echoing against the hardwood, until he reached the balcony. He stopped right in front of me. The severe, ruthless lines of his face softened into a look of absolute, unwavering devotion that he reserved entirely for me. He reached out with both hands, gently grasping my cold shoulders, and pulled me in, right there, in front of the dozens of relatives who had just spent the last 20 minutes trying to convince the world I was a delusional outcast. Julian leaned down and pressed a long, tender kiss against my forehead. He pulled back slightly, wrapping his warm hand securely around mine, his thumb brushing gently against my knuckles. "I am sorry I am late," Julian said, His voice was a rich, deep baritone, deliberately pitched loud enough to carry into the dead silence of the living room behind us. My security team had to clear out some absolute trash around the perimeter before I could come inside. The psychological collapse of my family was instantaneous and spectacular. Behind us, there was a sharp plastic crack as Chloe completely lost her grip on her smartphone, sending her live broadcast plummeting to shatter on the cedar floorboards. Aunt Brenda was gasping for air, clutching her diamond necklace as if she were having a sudden cardiovascular event. But the most satisfying reaction belonged to Derek. His aggressive bravado had entirely evaporated. His face was the color of dirty snow. He had finally managed to tear his eyes away from Julian's face and look down at the tactical lapel pins worn by the imposing security guards flanking the doors. He recognized the geometric silver crest instantly. It was the corporate emblem of the exact same cybersecurity empire he had just spent the entire evening trying to frame for his crimes. The hunter had finally arrived, and the trap was firmly shut. Aunt Brenda finally managed to scrape together a pathetic fraction of her usual arrogance. Her chest heaved under her diamond necklace as she took a single, shaky step forward, the floorboards creaking loudly beneath her feet. "Excuse me," she stammered, her voice completely lacking any of its previous venom. "Who exactly do you think you are, barging into a private family gathering, and what do you think you are doing?" Julian did not even dignify her existence with a glance. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the trembling coward standing across the room, with his free hand. Julian reached inside his dark wool coat and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He tossed it casually, yet with brutal precision, right onto the center of the extravagant banquet table. The heavy dossier landed forcefully against a crystal decanter, sending a cascade of expensive vintage red wine spilling across the white linen tablecloth like a spreading pool of blood. "Your golden boy is nothing but a desperate, pathetic thief," Julian announced. His voice was not a shout, but the absolute, cold authority in his tone commanded every single ear in the room. "Inside that folder is comprehensive, undeniable legal proof that Derek forged the signatures of every single elder in this family. He secretly mortgaged the entirety of your ancestral retirement estate and dumped every last cent into a collapsing, fraudulent digital currency scheme. He possesses absolutely zero wealth of his own." Derek let out a choked, pathetic noise, violently shaking his head as he backed up against the expensive stone fireplace. "He is lying," Derek shrieked, his voice cracking into a high pitch. "He is making it up!" Julian ignored the outburst. He simply looked around the room at the sea of terrified, pale faces. Late last night, Derek realized he was completely bankrupt. He attempted to execute a final, illegal wire transfer to drain the last remaining fraction of your family equity into an untraceable offshore account. He was prepared to leave every single one of you entirely homeless before sunrise. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with impending doom. "But he failed," Julian continued, finally turning his gaze to look down at me with profound respect. "He failed because the woman you have spent this entire evening humiliating, the woman you so eagerly wanted to lock away in a psychiatric ward, is the senior cyber defense architect who personally intercepted his fraudulent routing protocols. Molly is the only reason your bank accounts are not sitting at absolute zero right now. You mocked a brilliant white hat hacker while blindly praising the very parasite draining your blood." Right on cue, heavy footsteps echoed from the grand foyer. Two men in sharp suits, who had entered quietly behind Julian's security detail, stepped fully into the light. The golden badges of the state economic police flashed menacingly against their lapels. They walked straight past the trembling relatives, grabbed Derek by both shoulders, and spun him around. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the quiet villa was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. "Derek, you are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate identity theft," the lead detective stated plainly, completely ignoring Aunt Brenda, who suddenly unleashed a deafening, hysterical scream. She fell to her knees on the hardwood floor, clawing desperately at her designer dress. The illusion of the flawless, superior family shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before my eyes. The horrific reality of what they had almost done finally crashed down upon my relatives. Slowly, one by one, they turned their heads to look at me. The condescending sneers and fake pity were completely gone, replaced by a suffocating, sickening wave of pure terror and profound regret. My mother stood completely frozen, the glossy white business card for the psychiatric clinic slipping from her numb fingers and fluttering to the floor. Tears of utter shame welled up in her eyes. She took a hesitant step forward, reaching her shaking hand out toward me. "Molly, sweetheart, please, I did not know. We did not know." Before she could take another step, a towering member of Julian's vanguard stepped directly into her path, crossing his massive arms over his chest, forming an impenetrable wall of black fabric. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, at the aunt screaming on the floor, and at the cousin sobbing as he was dragged out the front doors. I felt absolutely nothing for them. There was no anger left, only a cold, freeing detachment. "I did not block that transfer to save any of you," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the sounds of Aunt Brenda's weeping. It was clear, steady, and sharp. "I saved that estate because it represents the lifelong hard work of our grandparents, and I refuse to let their legacy be destroyed by a coward. But from this exact moment forward, I do not owe this family name absolutely anything." Julian wrapped his arm firmly around my waist, pulling me close against his side. He looked at the devastated crowd one final time, a dark, mocking smile playing on the corner of his lips. "Next time you want to blindly mock a genius," Julian warned, his voice echoing like a final judgment, "make sure she does not hold the keys to the vault of your entire lives." He turned us around, and we walked away. We stepped out of the suffocating villa and into the crisp, freezing mountain night, leaving the absolute ruins of their arrogance behind us. The heavy doors of the armored vehicle closed, shutting out the pathetic cries of the past. As the convoy rolled down the mountain, Julian pulled me into his lap, holding me tightly. The shadows that had hidden us for so long were finally gone. Our love no longer needed the dark. It had stepped fully into the light, radiant, unbroken, and fiercely powerful. Thank you all so much for listening to the end of this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us out with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment. Your support directly pays our hardworking team, helping them feed their families and allowing us to keep creating even better stories to serve you. Thank you again, and see you in the next video.